A winning cookbook means many things. But as we've said on this podcast, few people write cookbooks to make money. So, what else is there? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for curious writers, readers, and cooks. This is Andrea and and today on the show, my co-host Molly Stevens and I want to talk about what it means to produce good work. Hey there, Molly. How are you?
Andrea, I'm great. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. You know, you've been around this industry for a long time. You've written, you've taught, you've done so many amazing things in the cookbook sphere. What do you think are the measures of a cookbook success?
Almost something different for every author. Certainly sales, as you've mentioned, as we talk about. An opportunity to write again, either for the same publisher or for somebody else, you grab their attention. For me, that's that sense that you made, for anybody, that sense that you made something you're really proud of. And hearing that people are cooking your recipes, that's the one that gets me, that the book's been helpful to people.
Yeah, a good book can lend its author credibility and professional respect.
Respect and attention, right? That comes along with it. And attention can be in big ways, small ways, and certainly awards, right? But the question is always, why do some books get attention and others don't?
You know, that's the $100,000 question. But we've got someone here who's thought a lot about cookbook awards. Charlotte Druckman. For those of you who don't know Charlotte, she's a journalist and writer. You've probably seen her byline in places like the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Cherry Bomb, and Bon Appetit. She's also the author of 5 books, and she is definitely an original thinker on many things, including a very, very interesting tournament of cookbooks, a competition held on Food 52, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Hey, Charlotte.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, we're so excited because you know your stuff so much better than we do.
I feel like I know my strong opinions, whether or not they are validated with actual stuff.
So let's back up a little bit. How did you get hooked on cookbooks?
I mean, it's such a cliche answer to say my mom cooking and having so many cookbooks was definitely, I think, the start of it. But if I'm going to be more analytical about it, I would also say that I was someone who loved magazines, specifically like glossy lifestyle magazines. Very, very early on, I would take my parents' magazines. I was obsessed with tables of contents and how you could have something that all held together coherently. You know, all these different pieces coming together that formed a whole that made sense collectively. That was always very interesting to me. And in a similar way, I was always fascinated with anything that was related to word and image, to the extent where, on the one hand, I was an English major with an art history minor. And then I ended up going to graduate school for art history because I wanted to be, for a moment, an art history professor. And I was specifically interested in theory. And again, you could see, my professors could see, I was constantly gravitating to anything that was related to word and image. And if I think about it in that sense, it also makes a lot of additional sense that I would love cookbooks as much as I do, just as a medium, because that's exactly what it is. It's a combination of words and images and multi-sensory cues coming together. I also love food, and it turns out I really love to cook, which is something I'm not even sure I realized until, long after I actually started writing about food. So I knew I liked it, but I didn't know how much I thought of it as a creative outlet. And I kind of see cookbooks in that vein too, but it's this completely, when it works, beautiful synchronicity of, an idea, an overarching idea, and then of communicating that through words, and words that are in different formats. You have the recipe, the head notes, sometimes they're essays, and then you have illustrations or you have photography. And I just think that, I don't know, I just really gravitated towards that even before I could have articulated to you why.
Well, it's so interesting because that your sense of art And food and writing, the visuals and the words make sense so much, even like when I look at the cover of Women on Food. But then the practical sense of things, like your cookbook, Stir, Sizzle, and Bake about cast iron cooking is just like, hey, it's not highfalutin stuff, but it's very practical at the same time, but it invites readers in. And then there's like Kitchen Remix. It's like, hey, make one dish, but take it in different directions. I think that you bridge a lot of aspects of cookbooks that allow different readers and cooks to plug in.
And that thing about the table of contents that you said, Charlotte, is so fascinating to me because so often I think authors come to the table of contents and kind of sigh and go, oh, this is an afterthought, or now I need to just write the outline, or don't take it as sort of such an integral organizational device. And, I think of Kitchen Remix, where you did that really cool thing with the 3 ingredients that work together. And so it's this sort of, you said it was inspired by a British cookbook. You talked about the Hugh, I never get his last name right.
Me too. I think it's like Fernley Whittenstall.
Well, yes. We'll put it in the show notes.
Okay, we know.
Yeah.
And I think Nigel Slater does a similar thing in Eat. But it's just such an interesting way to look at cookbooks through their organizational strategies as well.
So we've established, you guys, between the three of us, we have thought a lot about sort of the multidimensional aspect of a cookbook. It's more than just the pages. It's just this evolving thing. So let's talk about those awards and prizes. Like, they seem like they've been around forever, right? But they haven't. Molly, you've been around
forever.
Oh gosh,
not forever. It's not like you're prehistoric, but
yeah.
What's been your sense of cookbook awards since your career writing cookbooks?
Oh, I shouldn't say I never paid that much attention to them, but they weren't. When I wrote my first book or worked on books before I wrote a solo book, they were never on my radar as something that you could aim for. Do people write? I know an editor that I used to work with who specifically edited books to garner awards. I mean, she was very upfront that she wanted her authors' books to win awards. I don't know that I've spoken to authors who've said that. It's the question I think we ask a lot is, do they matter? I mean, sure, it feels great to win an award. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's an exciting moment in an author's career if your book gets nominated. But does it make any difference? I mean, certainly the awards that I'm most familiar with are the James Beard Foundation Awards, and then the IACP, which is the International Association of Culinary Professionals. But there's the Piglet, which Charlotte is creator of.
The Piglet is RIP, and we can talk about this later, but I think it's for the best that it is. I loved it very much. But yeah, I think it's unfortunate in some ways that there's nothing like it anymore, but I think it had run its course in its context.
Charlotte, let's kind of let our listeners catch up a little bit. The Piglet, I mean, it sounds so cute, right? But it was a clash of cookbook giants in one year, and it was wild. It was contentious. It made people mad and sad and gleeful at the same time. How did you all conceive of it? It started in 2010.
Yeah, so it was my idea. It started in the most organic way, which I always think the best ideas do. And that just kind of hits you over the head. I walked into a wall. Amanda Hesser had been the judge of the Morning News, the website. The Morning News hosted a tournament of novels. It was set up in a similar way where they would have different writers, some of them fiction writers, some of them not, like Amanda, some where it was more like cultural figures of note. And they would have them judge 2 novels in the bracket style tournament. And I actually didn't know it existed until Amanda posted, she was in one of the earlier years of that tournament, she posted her judgment. And I click on it on Twitter and I'm like, this is amazing. And my first thought is, why doesn't this exist for cookbooks? It would be so much more fun for cookbooks because you'd actually have to get in there and cook the recipes. I love book reviews. I read book reviews more than I read food writing, to be honest. But I just thought this would be so much fun because, you'd have to get in your kitchen. The way we judge cookbooks is different than the way we would judge a novel because there's a certain service factor in a cookbook that's very concrete,
Right.
that's not abstract,
Right.
you know? And I just thought, how cool would this be? How fun. And the really crazy part is that Amanda and I knew who each other were. I mean, I very much did. I looked up to her. I'd read, Cooking for Mr. Latte, the columns, and then the book version and everything. And we shared an editor. So when I tweeted, not even thinking, like there was no forethought. I should also add at this point that this was when Amanda had basically left the New York Times and was developing Food 52, but no one had any idea what Food 52 was. I just tweeted quite innocently, this should exist for cookbooks. And she said, yes. And then we ended up having an email exchange. And she said, Meryl, my business partner and I would love to talk to you about this. And I'm just sitting here thinking, wow, this is great. Amanda Hester wants to have a meeting. Like, wouldn't it be amazing if this cookbook tournament thing actually happened? Meanwhile, I kept looking up what her new business venture was, and all I kept seeing was crowdsourcing and algorithm. And in 2010, like I still half the time I'm like, who knows really what algorithm means? Like I was like, I don't even know what it is, but she's really smart. So okay, great. So we have this meeting. I thought they were so lovely and nice. And they said, look, we're starting this thing. It's still in beta. We think it would be really cool also to do the tournament on it. What do you think? I mean, you guys, what do you think? I thought. I was like, I went from having this fun idea that I didn't know could be realized into having two people saying we want to actually make the idea happen. Like, of course, I was like, sure. So it started very, very organically. The first year was literally Amanda and Meryl and me sitting in my living room with stacks of cookbooks that we liked, picking, the cookbooks. And I think one of the things that was important to all of us, I know it was really, really important to me, was that it's interesting to go back now to 2010 and look at the landscape, to look at what awards looked like, but also just to look at what cookbooks looked like. And it was, we didn't know this. Maybe we just had good timing. It was on the brink of cookbooks, I think, really starting to kind of blow up as cultural phenomena. Mm-hmm. But also where you started seeing more sort of playing around with genre. And we were really interested in the beginning with cookbooks that weren't necessarily the obvious cookbooks. So I think that first year it was Amanda actually who'd gotten an early copy of, do you guys remember when Canal House was quarterly?
Yes.
Yes.
And she said, you guys, this thing is launching. I think it's kind of sweet, and it's quarterly. And we were like, how cool, let's nominate it. And again, this is not normally, would a quarterly count as a cookbook? Would it not? If it was an awards situation, it probably wouldn't be considered a cookbook until it was actually in proper cookbook form. So we were very interested in, I think, we did like Amy Pennington's book, which was The Urban Pantry. They were smaller books. They weren't sort of the blockbuster. I'm not saying we didn't have some of those in there, but our interest was finding the things that didn't necessarily fit, the things that we just thought were really cool. That was one of the reasons that I really loved it. But I also loved it because the whole point was to celebrate subjectivity. The Piglet was so transparent. It was basically us saying, we just really love these cookbooks, especially in the beginning before Food 52 became a brand, because I think that's where things get trickier and where the conversation shifts, to be honest. But before, it was really like this branded entity. It was just like, we love these books. And the idea here is for you to see how people engage with these books. Because for me, when I want to know if I'm going to like a cookbook or not, it helps me if like-minded people, or if someone who isn't like-minded at all, but is telling me where they're coming from, if they can let me know what they thought of the cookbook, how they used it, I find this immensely, immensely helpful. And we also chose people who we knew were really great writers. So the point of the Piglet was more to showcase their writing. It was to show you the quirkiness of people's relationships with cookbooks, because there is no universal cookbook and there's no universal relationship with a cookbook, which is one of the reasons I have such a hard time with awards, to be honest, with, institutional awards. It's like, how can you say this is best for whom? And the other thing I really liked about the Piglet, and it was hard, judges kind of often didn't get it. And I would always be the one that kind of tried to break it down because to me it made sense. And that's whatever that means. But I always looked at it kind of like the idea of a table of contents, right? It was each cookbook is sort of presenting you with a promise of what it's going to do. The question is, how well do you think it lived up to that promise? So I think it's okay to take two books that come from very, very different points of view or very, very different genres and basically just ask the question, how well did each of these live up to its promise?
Yeah.
And it is subjective. I think to say that these awards aren't subjective, that's the biggest lie of all.
Let's back up and explain the institutional awards. We mentioned a couple, the James Beard, the IACP. They use a panel of judges that is often, I don't know if we certainly don't know who they are during the process. We might find out at the end, but there's a group of judges that review every book and books, their categories. And whereas the Piglet, you did something very different. One, there were no categories, right? Every book could just stand on its own. For, as you said, does it deliver on the promise of the book? But then what you did with judging was entirely different than a standard awards.
It was written a lot more like if you were reading a book review, except that it was of two books and the judge's experience, or we can say the reviewer if it makes it sort of easier conceptually, but the reviewer's experience of those cookbooks. And we also went for people who had really distinct voices as writers or points of view. So you'd have a lot of humor. I mean, we can debate this because I still have some feelings about it. But when you are running a tournament like that, you always have to defend your judges. I mean, that's your job. Your job is not to start being like, yeah, that judge sucked, whatever. But we had some judges who someone judged a book where they really hated spicy food and they judged a book where they were making all this stuff with chili peppers. We had stuff like that, but it was hilarious. The thing, it was hilarious. And the judge never lied. I mean, the judge was very open about their preferences, but I thought that was just completely trippy and a great example of completely how just subjective this is. So the Piglet was meant to be fun. It was meant to be a way to see good writing about cookbooks because honestly, we don't see a lot of really analytical writing of cookbooks. We see a lot of things that look like rehashed press releases or lists of here are the best books of the season, but you don't really get into the experience of cooking with the book or engaging with the words in the book, or you don't have that. And I think that's probably what I miss the most about the Piglet is just honestly having that to read out in the world.
A lot of these cookbook awards that we mentioned, like the James Beard and the IACP awards, before they became what they became, they were called Tastemakers awards. And it was really interesting, this notion of the tastemakers. This is what, who chooses what to be the thing, to speak for the culture, to speak for the moment that year.
Not to be super cynical about it, but I feel like another word for that in today's speak would be gatekeeper, exactly. But we would just call it tastemaker.
Yes. But to know that as the history of those awards is very interesting. Once that you think about that and we think about, how books are selected for, say, Art of Eating or the Gourmand World Cookbook Awards and all the other ones, and for the Piglet, you then kind of go, it is very subjective. And I've judged cookbooks for awards. And one of the things that pains me, I will tell the both of you, is that there are so many good books out there published every year. And there are thousands of cookbooks published every year. And the ones that are received and the ones that get forwarded to the finals, there's just so few of them. But there are so many good ones out there too. So many sleepers.
There are so few of them. And one of the questions I like to raise to all of us, just almost as a rhetorical question, is, don't you find it odd that with all those cookbooks out there, we just hear about the same, maybe 25 cookbooks over and over and over again? And why is that? And again, I do not mean to be the cynical voice, but there is a good reason. And a lot of that has to do with, the monopoly of the big publishers, but also their budgets for PR, the writers, how much privilege they have to afford outside PR. There's a whole other layer to this. And there's a lot of what happens with awards that even when you're trying to be neutral, if a book has gotten that much buzz, it's already in the back of your mind. Whereas if you have a really small book that was self-published or independently published, it's odds of even the person knowing how to send it in to get it nominated or to pay to get it nominated. Like there's so many kinds of barriers to entry. I mean, there are also to be honest, a lot of crappy cookbooks that get made every year that are just like, rehashing trends. But I think there are also a lot of cookbooks that we've never seen that are probably really special. And I always think about that. I think about, I have a lot of friends who are food writers who take these awards very, very seriously. I wish they didn't. It's hard sometimes to have conversations about that stuff. And I think they know to some extent that they're being irrational about caring so much, but people get really caught up in that stuff. And it is sort of funny because there is something kind of arbitrary about the whole thing. And also, I don't actually think they have much to do with book sales. So this is another issue I've always sort of wondered about.
It's funny that one of the oldest awards is what is it, the Andre Simon? It's a UK award. It started like in 1978, and I think that's one of the oldest ones on record. And when you sort of step back, and I certainly am cynical about a lot of this too, but when you step back and think about sort of what would the ideal of these awards be, that they would do what you talked about with the Piglet, that they would celebrate books, that they would bring attention to books, that they would be a reason. I mean, why do they have the Oscars? So the movies, people go to see the movies, it would draw attention to the medium. But somehow in the orchestration of the awards, I think we should step back and say that the Piglet, which unfortunately no longer exists, but the Art of Eating Award, which very much exists, is in its
7 years.
But those are two that I know of that are not the pay-to-play model, meaning the people organizing the awards seek out the titles, look for what they think are representative or, interesting, deserve recognition, as opposed to the other big awards where you need to pay money to submit, you need to send your book in.
Multiple copies.
So all the judges have them. And if you're a independent, self-published, scrappy author, you may not even know you to do that. And you certainly might not be able to afford to do that.
And sales don't, there's a wonderful gluten-free at home baking book, Gluten-Free Baking at Home, that won an ICP award. And it's a fabulous book, totally reliable, beautifully written, beautifully photographed. And yet that author, I don't think received the same kind of halo effect that some of these other authors received, who've received multiple awards. And again, in the past years, if you take a look at who won these awards, so some of the similar names pop up over and over again. And I will admit, I've been nominated for many of them, but I only won once, and that's okay.
Andrea, I would say objectively, I would award you. As someone who actually cooks from your cookbooks.
Well, thank you. But, I have so many issues once that I started judging and looking on the other side of this. And I've also been on the side of where I've been nominated and not won. And in the past, publishers didn't promote the fact that you were a finalist for an award. I remember my first book garnered 3 finalist nominations. And afterwards, when I didn't win, it was like, it's over, because people really didn't know what Beard and ICP were. And nowadays, people do. And so that's mentioned, and that means something. But in the past, it was just very inside baseball, very industry oriented. Some of your friends, Charlotte, you mentioned, who take these awards so seriously, that's that is a giant feather in their cap.
Yeah.
They're going to use the awards as a stepping stone to something else. It's change in meaning. And I think that one of the things that you said earlier about cookbooks being this cultural thing, this status thing, that's really been a very recent phenomenon. And we're witnessing that.
I think one of the things that's been so difficult, I don't know if you feel this way, you guys as cookbook authors, but I have a hard time with this idea that everything has to appeal to everyone. And I think the everyone needs to be put in quotes because it is that sort of like there's this kind of generic everyone who I guess represents dominant media culture, imagined audience person, right? And I think about it and I think about what I want to do with my books. And I don't actually care if it's for everyone. I'd rather it not be for everyone. I keep asking lately, like, whatever happened to niche marketing? I ask this for a reason, just because in terms of building communities, real communities who are, you know, if you think of restaurants and having regulars, but I think it's the same thing with readers, especially when you're talking about cooking and teaching people to cook or cooking with people. You kind of want to find your audience and you want to then, I think, make sure that that's who you're serving. I don't think it's particularly useful in terms of doing the best work to be constantly thinking about how you can appeal to everybody, because that always means making compromises. And it's one thing to make compromises so that the people you actually want to reach can get the best experience from your book, but it's different to be making compromises for a whole range of people to be able to engage with something. And I don't know, I would rather just reach the people who really are interested in that thing and reach them consistently and well in a way that they're happy with. And I think that awards, unfortunately, have been playing into the sort of everything appealing to everyone problem. And I think it's interesting now because I do think with the beards, like I believe they're changing some of the categories, but I think the categories could help in this. But I don't think they do. I think the way the categories are set up actually make everything almost more generic.
Yeah.
Say more about that. So the categories are things like best baking book, best restaurant book.
Yeah. And I'm just like, but for whom?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
but best baking book for whom?
Right.
And like, to say you have a best baking book and one of those books is all about, let's say, like laminating dough and puff pastry, and
Right.
one is about like everyday baking at home for people who are just getting started. Again, like if this was the Piglet, that's fine because you could really get into the nitty gritty of each book and say which one did that thing better. But when we see institutionalized awards, that's not what we're seeing.
That are trying to.
There's just one winner.
Yeah.
And we just see the title of the book and it's like, this was the best baking book. But like, let's say you're just starting out baking and the book that wins best baking book of the year is the one all about laminating. What are you going to do with that book? So in a funny way, it's almost not surprising that they have not had a huge impact on sales, because how could they? What could those awards mean? Again, when we're talking about something that's about service, ultimately about service, what service is it of you if you want to use a book in your kitchen, follow its recipes, to know it won an award? To some extent, it becomes not very useful.
Right.
It almost becomes more daunting. Like when the restaurant book wins an award, it's like, that's great. I'm not trying to cook restaurant food here.
Right. These awards are funny because I see oftentimes branded cookbooks pop up, like America's Test Kitchen books are these compilations, and they're put together by a very organized, large entity, go up against books that are written by one person or maybe two people. And I think that that's where the competition is totally unfair.
It's not fair.
You know, if you've got a brand and organization putting a book together, they need to be in a separate category, because that's also providing information for a different kind of audience. And it's produced by a machine practically.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, the people who put the content together for that, there's no one single person that's gone through every single recipe that can vet it and can like provide a complete arc. So I have a lot of misgivings. I do think the awards can be improved. I think that they're good to a certain extent, but there are times when I'm always like saying, can't we like break this up a little bit? But it's, you know, like we have a lot of chef awards, right? Like Beard has like a ton of chef awards for different regions and stuff. Yet in cookbooks, Beard has very few number of categories, to tell their truth, and they've been reducing them.
And that's what I mean too, where it's, again, you get back to that question of what happened to niche marketing. There's not really a lot of room in those categories for things that are just doing one small, even weird thing, but like extremely well. Yes, they're single subject, but if it's too out there, too small, I don't think you're going to see it nominated. The single subject stuff still tends to be pretty, like, no pun intended, by the book. I guess I tend to think of them as being more kind of reactionary or even retrospective a lot of times than they are really like existing in the present. And even when you say we see the same people winning awards, at some point you're like, is that person just winning the award because everyone just now knows that person? And or you'll see someone who's written like a whole number of books and has not gotten an award, and then they win an award for the book because it's like, finally it was their time. But you could say, but that wasn't even their best book. I think also to say that they're not political is also kidding yourself. And again, I'm not saying that like the Piglet that we didn't have our biases, but on the other hand, it was very clear that who the people picking the books were. And it was very clear who was judging them.
Right. So you said back in the beginning that it was celebrating the subjectivity of the awards, the Piglet, whereas the other ones seem to have a fallacy of objectivity, which is it's impossible.
Yeah. People didn't kind of believe it when I said this sometimes, like they thought I was just trying to like cover up for some kind of like, I don't know, conspiracy theory. But I always would say for us, it was, we really did think all of the books we nominated were winners. If we didn't, we wouldn't have nominated them because we had no idea which of them was going to end up being the winner.
Right.
We couldn't rig it. So we had to pick books where we would have been really excited if any of them won.
The people you chose, they were like off the wall.
The judges.
Yeah.
People who you didn't think would come in to pick up a cookbook and cook from them. So, you know, the people who do cookbook judging for, you know, Beard and some of these other folks, they're like an ICP. They're very knowledgeable about cookbooks, or they should be, and they're really into them. But the thing about the Piglet was like, this was this kind of strange thing of you never know who will pick up a cookbook and start cooking from it. And so everything that I read with a certain, you know, many grains of salt, to put it that way, because it was entertaining reading and it was a kind of literary expression that I was like, yeah, I get it. But people got upset sometimes with the judgments.
Really got upset. Yeah, we kind of wanted to be like, you guys, it's like, it's not meant to be perfect and it's not meant to be, you know, the idea is that by the time the winner has won, it will have been cooked by 4 different judges, I think, by the time we get to the final. So if you're looking at that experience collectively, you know, you might see, we had like Ina Garten judge one year, you know, like you would see Ina Garten, but then you might also see like Roz Chast, and she did her judgment in comic form, which was brilliant. And she's not someone who, she cooks, but she's in quotes a regular home cook. She's not like a food writer person. But there's also something about knowing what it's like for a Roz Chast to cook from that book that I think can also be really helpful, especially maybe not for us, but if you're someone who's trying to decide whether or not you should buy a book, depending on your skill level, it might actually be really helpful to have seen what someone like Roz Chast thought of what it was like to cook that book. And I think that's also part of that experience. And it is different than saying we had a panel of experts judge this thing.
Because the reality with cookbooks is it's not the panel of experts. This is what you've been saying. It's the panel of experts are not who's using the books. So it's to have them evaluating it is an interesting situation. Yeah,
it is. And I think they've changed it. I'm really, really glad to know that in the last few years, you know, the Beards, I think they've been very much trying to change things. But it was brought to my attention a few years ago that of the people on the judging committee for cookbooks on the Beards, I think only one of them had written a cookbook, if that. And I was kind of like, well, who are these judges then? Because if you don't have an experience of, if not writing, then editing or something, what is your expert point of view? Because I don't know. Yeah. So I mean, yes, the Piglet was definitely meant to be taken with a grain of salt. It was not meant to be like a definitive, like, best book in America.
We've talked so much about it. And for any listener who never checked it out, it's still available on food52.com.
It is.
And it is entertaining reading. You know, what would an ideal awards program look like?
I don't think it exists.
Okay, what if the three of us, knowing our skepticism, knowing things don't have to be perfect, knowing things will ever, constantly improve, evolve, how would we award, on an annual basis, award or recognize books that were excellent or original or impactful?
So I actually don't think that the ideal award thing, I don't think it exists, or I don't think that there's any way to do something that exists that is completely neutral. Like, I just don't think that's possible, right? And then I think once you start laying bare all of your different like priorities and subjectivities and all of that stuff, it probably just stops being helpful. So there's kind of like, what are you supposed to do with that? I just wish you could go around with like the good fairy, little wands, and be like, I really loved your cookbook. Just like, a magic wand of blessings. Like, we loved your book,
Well, yeah.
That would be nice.
I cook through cookbooks that I am attracted to, and I cook through them and I read them and I read, the introductions, I read the pantry, section, and then I work through a number of recipes. I wish I had more time to do that. But when I really love something, I'll support that book in social media. I wish that, to be honest, like there was a way that we could have conversations with authors of new books and like cook through their books with them visually on, I don't know, like on YouTube or something on two screens.
Or that more people, because Andrea, you do a wonderful job of it on your social media, and you celebrate an author or a book, or sometimes it's just a magazine article or something in a newspaper that's not your own, but that you've, for one reason or another, fallen in love with, been inspired by. And I think if more of us did that and said, I just found this little book, and instead of always just gravitating to the echo chamber.
Yeah. I think the really sad thing about that is that is what we want things to be like. But I think we're being encouraged in so many different ways to do all the sort of fast food version of sharing information, whether it's like TikTok or, Instagram. And we're also constantly, as authors, and this is something I'm not good at, I don't feel comfortable with, so I'm probably never going to be a big seller. And that's fine by me. But it's a conversation you have to have with yourself at some point, which is that I think we see that the people now who are most successful with their books are the people who are basically mostly using social media, and they're using it to self-promote. Like what Andrea's doing is remarkable because it's not about self-promotion. And also, Andrea, because you already have a platform, you've been proven and people trust you. And so you're able to do that. But I don't know how many, if we're talking now about like younger people starting out and what it looks like for them to be successful and get opportunities, the odds are against someone who would do all those things that Andrea does. And that's really heartbreaking, I think. And maybe I'm being too bleak about that. I want to be a little more optimistic. But if we look now at what book sales look like and whose books are selling and what they're doing, it's a lot of personal hyping, and I'm sure they don't love it either, by the way. I am not going to sit here and say I'm sure they love every minute of it. It's work.
Yeah. It's a different kind of work.
There is a lot of self-focus out there.
Yeah. The books that are selling at the top of the heap are not the award winners either, to bring this back to our theme.
No,
they're not. I think that make good books. I mean, what are your, words of wisdom for people who are writing books out there, are looking at cookbooks and evaluating them, evaluating their own work or evaluating the work of others? What advice do you have for them in terms of judging for themselves what makes a good book?
Well, I'm going to not give the advice that's about making money, because I'm terrible with that stuff. And because I refuse to do that, because I want to give people advice so that I like their books. I guess it's selfish, but I always say this to people who say they want to write cookbooks. You have to be so passionate about it, because the likelihood that you're going to make money off of it, you guys said this at the top of the show, it's really slim. You know, there's some people who break out and that's amazing. But basically, if you're lucky, you break even on a cookbook. That's like on a good day. And you also have to realize the way publishers are setting it up, they are not concerned about you making money either. They're more concerned about them making money. So you have to really want to do the project. You have to believe in the project. It's not just vanity. It's not just, I want to write a cookbook because I want to write a cookbook. I once sat down with a chef who thought that they wanted to write a cookbook and kept changing their mind about what it could be. It was a tiring experience. And I finally just said, but why do you want to write a cookbook? It's the one thing I don't know. We've had all these conversations. Why do you want to write a cookbook? And the answer was, well, I just think that's where I am in my career. Now I'm supposed to write the cookbook. And I was like, I don't think you should write a cookbook. You have to believe in it. And you have to believe in whatever your concept is too. You know, you have to be like, I have this idea for a cookbook because I don't think it exists, or I don't think it's been done well. And I think so many people would really benefit if they understood this better. Or I'd like to get people really excited about this thing. You know, cookbooks are a form of communication. It's really, really important that you care about the people that you're communicating with. And then when you do sit down to write the cookbook, that should always be top of mind for you, is not, let me show you how smart I am or how even well written this is. It's that, like, this is a book that I want you to be able to use. What needs to happen so that you can get the most out of this cookbook? Those are probably the things that I would give as advice. I don't think that's necessarily the advice that would be given from the point of view of like an agent or a publisher, because they're going to be looking much more at like, do you have a lot of followers? And, you know, how are you going to reach them? And is this, you know, easy enough for people who've never made grilled cheese before? And
well, that's because you're a cookbook lover.
Well,
Charlotte.
yeah, and I'm saying this is not necessarily the most practical advice, but if I'm going to do anything to support or protect writers, the first thing I'm going to say is it's a relatively thankless job in a lot of ways, or the thanks you get is the working on it part, and then hopefully people cooking your recipes and letting you know that they did. I think that's probably the most gratifying. So knowing that going in, and then trying to write cookbooks that kind of celebrate those things would probably be the best advice that I had.
You, Molly?
Yeah, it's funny. So I don't have as much judging experience as you do, Andrea, or you, Charlotte, but I've done some. And it's so interesting because even after so many years of looking at cookbooks and writing cookbooks, there's this moment where I'm like reminding myself to think for myself. I mean, I have to do it consciously because, you know, I'm on the socials. I pay attention. You know, I mean, I'm not that plugged in, but I'm somewhat plugged in. And I can feel my brain or my thoughts being pulled towards what's the popular opinion going to be? Mm-hmm. You know, is this going to be popular? As opposed to using my analytical skills that go all the way back to when I first learned how to learn and make a decision. And I think that's something, that's why it's such an honor to get to be invited to judge, because it's such a good exercise for your brain to be like, no, they're not asking you what they think will be popular. They're asking for your opinion on what's good and does it deliver on the promise of the book. And I think that is just such a key piece of this, because every book is written for a different audience, and that promise of the book, and it's not in the flap copy. Can we just get rid of flap copy? Because the flap copy, I think our listeners, if you learn anything, authors don't write flap copy, but what's in the introduction, what's in the table of contents, you know, who it's dedicated to, that sort of thing. And if that appeals to you, you know, does the book deliver on that?
Yeah. No, you know, whenever I say the word judge, it kind of gives me like, it's like creeps, because it's so judgmental, you know, it's a creepy word. So that's why I evaluate. How do you evaluate your own work? You know, and I always think empathy and compassion for yourself and the author and the bookmakers. it's a slog to make a cookbook, but it's fulfilling and it's thrilling to make a good one, and it's thrilling to use a good one.
Mm-hmm.
So I always try to encourage people to make good books and to use good books. And with that, I wanted to thank the two of you for engaging in this really lively conversation today.
Thanks for hosting.
Thank you, guys. We could get rid of awards and keep this podcast, and that it'd be just fine by me.
Thank you all for listening to Everything Cookbooks. If you've got a question or a comment, ping us on Instagram at Everything Cookbooks or send us a message at our website, everythingcookbooks.com. If you're interested in any of the books that we mentioned, check the show notes and also bookshop.org. Much gratitude goes out to our editor, Abby Circatella. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep on cooking.